What would you do if you spent 12 hours talking to a stranger, sharing your deepest secrets and most painful regrets, only to discover that the person sitting across from you was the reason for all that pain in the first place? That's exactly what happened to Catherine Moore on a freezing December night at a homeless shelter in Philadelphia. And the truth she uncovered will make you question whether fate is real or if the universe just has a twisted sense of humor. Catherine had been volunteering at the Hope Street shelter for 3 years, working the overnight shift every Friday because she couldn't sleep on Fridays anyway. Fridays were the anniversary of the worst day of her life, the day she'd walked out of a hospital 26 years ago without her newborn baby boy. Catherine had been 19, addicted to drugs, living on the streets, and when she gave birth to a healthy baby in the emergency room, Child Protective Services had taken him immediately. She'd never even gotten to hold him, never gotten to tell him she was sorry, never gotten to explain that she'd wanted to keep him, but knew she couldn't give him a safe life. The courts had terminated her parental rights within 6 months, and her son had been adopted by a family whose names she'd never know. For 26 years, Catherine had carried that weight. She'd gotten clean, rebuilt her life, become a social worker herself, and dedicated every Friday night to helping people who were exactly where she'd been all those years ago. It was her penance, her way of making amends for being the kind of mother who'd lost her child to the system. On this particular Friday in mid-December, the shelter was packed because temperatures had dropped below freezing, and the city had opened emergency beds. Catherine was working the intake desk, checking people in, making sure everyone had a warm meal and a safe place to sleep, when a young man walked in who immediately caught her attention. He was probably mid-20s, tall and thin, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. His clothes were worn but clean, and there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested he hadn't been homeless long, that he was still fighting to maintain some sense of dignity in an undignified situation. Catherine checked him in under the name James Wilson, gave him a meal voucher and a bed assignment, and that should have been the end of their interaction. But around 2 in the morning, when most of the shelter residents were asleep, Catherine noticed James sitting alone in the common area, staring at a cup of cold coffee, like it held the answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Something about his posture, the slump of his shoulders, the defeated look in his eyes, it reminded Catherine of herself all those years ago. So she poured 2 fresh cups of coffee, walked over, and asked if he wanted some company. James looked up, surprised that anyone was paying attention to him, and nodded. What started as a simple conversation turned into hours of talking. James told her he'd been a teacher, that he'd lost his job when budget cuts hit the school district, that his savings had run out 3 months ago, and that he'd been couch surfing with friends until he'd run out of friends willing to help. He was ashamed, embarrassed, couldn't believe this was his life now. Catherine listened with the kind of understanding that only comes from having been there yourself. And slowly, gently, she started sharing her own story. She told him about her past, about the drugs and the streets and hitting rock bottom. And then, for the first time in years, she told someone about her son. She told James about the hospital, about the social workers taking her baby, about the adoption she'd had no say in, about the 26 years of wondering if her son was okay, if he was happy, if he ever thought about the mother who'd lost him. James went very quiet, and Catherine noticed his hands were shaking as he set down his coffee cup. She asked if he was all right, and James looked at her with tears in his eyes and said, "What day was he born? Your son. What day was he born?" Catherine's heart started racing because there was something in James's voice, something desperate and hopeful and terrified all at once. She told him the date, December 18th, 26 years ago, at Philadelphia General Hospital. James pulled out his wallet with trembling hands and showed her his driver's license. His birthday was listed as December 18th, 26 years ago. He'd been born at Philadelphia General Hospital. And his original birth certificate, the one he'd requested when he turned 18 and started searching for his biological parents, listed his birth mother as Catherine Elizabeth Moore. The coffee cup slipped from Catherine's hand and shattered on the floor, but neither of them moved. They just sat there staring at each other, two strangers who'd spent the last 4 hours pouring their hearts out to each other, not knowing they were the two people who'd been searching for each other for 26 years. Catherine couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what was happening. This was her son. The baby she'd held in her heart for 26 years was sitting right in front of her, and she'd spent 4 hours talking to him without knowing it. James started crying. Not quiet tears, but huge, gasping sobs, and he told her everything. He told her that his adoptive parents had been wonderful, had given him a great childhood, but they'd both died in a car accident when he was 22. He'd been alone since then, had always felt like something was missing, had spent years trying to find Catherine, but the adoption records were sealed, and he'd hit dead end after dead end. He'd never imagined that he'd end up homeless, never imagined that rock bottom would lead him to the one person he'd been searching for. Catherine reached across the table and took his hands, and they held onto each other like they were drowning, and the other person was the only life raft in sight. She told him she was sorry, said it over and over until the words lost meaning. Sorry for not being able to keep him. Sorry for all the years he'd spent wondering. Sorry that their reunion had to happen like this, in a homeless shelter at 3 in the morning. But James shook his head and said she had nothing to apologize for. He told her that finding out he was adopted hadn't made him love his parents any less, and finding out why she'd given him up didn't make him love her any less either. He said he'd spent his whole life wondering if his birth mother had loved him, if she'd thought about him, if she'd cared. And now he knew. She'd cared so much that she'd spent 26 years trying to save other people's children because she couldn't save her own. Over the next few months, Catherine helped James get back on his feet. She used every connection she had in social services to find him housing, helped him apply for unemployment benefits, connected him with schools that were hiring. But more than that, they built a relationship. They met for coffee every week, shared meals, slowly filled in 26 years of missing pieces. James met Catherine's husband, the man she'd married 10 years ago, who'd known about her past and loved her anyway. Catherine met James's fiancée, a kindergarten teacher who'd stuck by him through his hardest months. They became family, not in spite of their complicated past, but because of it. And here's the thing that Catherine couldn't stop thinking about. If James hadn't lost his job, if he hadn't lost his apartment, if he hadn't ended up at that specific shelter on that specific night, they might never have found each other. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the universe conspiring to give us exactly what we need. James had to lose everything to find the one thing he'd been missing. Catherine had to face her worst nightmare, seeing someone who reminded her of her own rock bottom, to discover that her son was right in front of her. They'd both been searching for 26 years, and fate had brought them together in the most unlikely place imaginable. If this story touched your heart, if it made you believe that even the darkest nights can lead to the brightest mornings, then hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel because I share real stories about real people that prove miracles happen when we least expect them. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Do you believe everything happens for a reason? Have you ever had a moment where losing everything led you to finding what really mattered? Share your story because your experience could be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Remember that the people we're meant to find will find us, that rock bottom sometimes has to happen before we can climb back up, and that love has a way of surviving even 26 years of separation. Stay hopeful, stay open to possibility, and never underestimate the power of a Friday night conversation with a stranger who might not be a stranger after all.